Our cartoons on the blackboard are reasonably accurate. They're good symbols.
In the second frame, which is which?
The unqualified absolute has got white hatching on it throughout. I identified one circle. Right. The universal absolute is the middle circle, starting with the third frame.
And would you call that the deity, the second frame right there, the yoke?
This is the qualified absolute.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And the deity absolute is a semi-synonym for the qualified absolute. Prior to this situation, I like to use the term qualified absolute. From this situation on, I think the term deity absolute is better. The term qualified absolute, in my mind, signifies the Father still filling the potential of absolute deity. The term deity absolute, in my mind, signifies a situation in which the Father, as a person, no longer does this only as the Trinity. It is the Trinity which fills this potential at this level. At this concept level, it's the Father. It's God. The term Father is hardly appropriate because we're thinking of a pre-Son situation. Always remember, the looking glass is here. Any attempt to go back of this, we're going through the looking glass, like L. The unqualified absolute. This is the second most difficult concept in the paper. The unqualified absolute. You know what the most difficult concept is? The universe, the first source and center. We don't think of it that way because the Father concept is pretty easy. That's only one facet of the first source and center. Don't kid yourself. The first source and center is the most difficult thing of all.
Are we going to take that up at all?
Yes, we will. We'll talk about all the absolutes. The unqualified absolute is non-personal, extra-divine, and undeified. Why? Because in our second frame, all that which could be personal, divine, and deified was removed. This is the residue. The Father fractionally distilled infinity, and he fractionated out the personal, which includes the pre-personal and the super-personal, the divine, and deity. The unqualified, I think of it as the residual sludge. The unqualified absolute is therefore devoid of personality, divinity, and all creator prerogatives. Neither fact nor truth, experience nor revelation, philosophy nor absonity. That's a peculiar use of the word absonity, absonite, are able to penetrate the nature and character of this absolute without universe qualification, hence unqualified. They're telling us we aren't going to know anything about him. You'll notice when the universal censor in paper 10 debates, will we get to the deity absolute, he hedges. But then he says flatly, we'll never get up to the universal absolute. The question of the unqualified absolute just doesn't even come up. He's two absolutes removed from that which is debatable. Let it be made clear that the unqualified absolute is a positive reality pervading the grand universe and apparently extending with equal space presence on out into the force activities and pre-material evolutions of the staggering stretches of the space regions beyond the seven superuniverses. In paper 12, they speak of the four outer space levels as the domains of the unqualified absolute. The unqualified absolute is not a mere negativism of philosophic concept, predicated on the assumptions of metaphysical sophistries concerning the universality, dominance, and primacy of the unconditioned and the unqualified. The unqualified absolute is a positive universe over control in infinity. This over control is space force unlimited, but is definitely conditioned by the presence of life, mind, spirit, and personality, and is further conditioned by the will reactions and purposeful mandates of the Paradise Trinity.
Something like us.
Well, that's a mouthful. To me, that means that when the Paradise Trinity takes snuff, the unqualified absolute sneezes. Yes,
That space force,
that's that space potency, I think.
unlimited.
There's no limit to the ability of the unqualified absolute to release his grasp of space potency.
Would that domain go beyond the borders of the fourth outer space level?
I'm sure it does, because it's unlimited. And that is a limit.
Yeah.
We get the foundations for Cosmos Infinite here. Yes, it's quite large. You ain't fenced in.
I always wonder how large. I mean, how large is infinity?
Many.
More than that.
Many. There's many to the second power.
In other words, how many acres
Yes.
did the original I am contract for before he started all this?
He's got an open-end account.
Got everything.
Okay.
It's the best way I can express it. He's got an open-end account.
What is this I am?
The I am is not a reality. The I am is the concept back in the first frame. And remember, we entered the looking glass in the last frame. Everything on the blackboard is behind the looking glass, save only the last picture. The I am is a conceptual concession which they make to our thinking. We want a starting point, so they give it to us. Now, the infinite maybe is a better concept. The Father infinite is maybe still better. We are convinced that the unqualified absolute is not an undifferentiated and all-pervading influence comparable either to the pantheistic concepts of metaphysics or to the sometime either hypothesis of science. Pantheism assumes that there is a God and he's everywhere. In other words, we are God, Bud's house is God, Tiglath is God, and so on. This takes God and so atomizes him that it is equivalent to no God. The ether hypothesis of science assumes that space is a very fine-grained reality called ether. And of course, space is not a fine-grained reality. Space is emptiness from the finite standpoint. The unqualified absolute is force unlimited. No end to space potency. They aren't going to run out. Every time they drill for a nebulae, they're going to hit a gusher. The unqualified absolute is deity conditioned. Well, that's that linkage up there. When total deity acts, well, let's start it off better. When the Paradise Trinity acts in the final sense, this activates the deity absolute. This activation of the deity absolute is transmitted through the universal absolute to the unqualified absolute, and in this way the unqualified absolute is deity conditioned. We do not fully perceive the relation of the unqualified absolute to the spirit realities of the universes. I don't think there's any direct relation, except through the unifying and equipoising presence of the universal absolute. But there is no perceivable relationship directly. The universal absolute, we logically deduce, was inevitable when the universal Father's absolute free will act differentiated universe realities into deified and undeified, personalizable and non-personalizable values. See frame 2 on the blackboard. You can't stop with frame 2. You've got instantly to go on to frame 3. This relationship is a reality, and it deitizes. I don't say personalizes, it deitizes. The universal absolute is the deity phenomenon indicative of the resolution of the tension created by the free will act of thus differentiating universe reality. Frame 2 sets up an intolerable stress in infinity. When you break the balance in frame 1, you set up a chain reaction in frame 2, and a stress situation is created which must be resolved. Hence you must go forward to frame 3, which now resolves the stress. You see what God's doing? He's setting up not devils and hells as threats. He's setting up stresses and then resolving those stresses in one way or another. He sets up a stress in a human being when he puts an adjuster in that human being. And that stress to me could be symbolized by saying that there's a rubber band stretching all the way back to Divinington, where the adjuster came from, to paradise, to all practical intents and purposes. This adjuster wants to cohere in the Father. And this adjuster is attached to us. And unless we actually snap that rubber band, the tension of that rubber band will draw us into paradise. But we can cut the rubber band, Betty.
That's the deal.
When the Father sets up a situation in time and space where energy matter is dominant, and then puts people and mind and spirit out here, he challenges them. He challenges these people. Can you take over now? You've got the mind to do it. Can you so affiliate mind with spirit that your takeover is stable and progressive? Or will you fail to affiliate mind with spirit, in which event your successes will be evanescent and ephemeral. They'll be here today and gone tomorrow. That is a temporal victory in contrast to an eternal victory. Temporal victories are undone. Eternal victories stand forever. The universal absolute resolves the tension created by the free will act of differentiating universe reality into two phases, personalizable and non-personalizable. The universal absolute functions as the associative coordinator of these sum totals of existential potentialities. Frame 3. Does the universal absolute remind you of anything else in reality?
For a long time, I couldn't get away from the universal absolute being, in a sense, a tool of the deity. But that does away with the idea of coordinator. But
It is a tool.
does it work automatically in response, or does it?
I think the universal absolute is intelligent, purposive, and all those things. Universal absolute, to me, is most like the conjoint actor. And those two are most like the first source and center, extending across the board, dealing with the personal and the impersonal. Much as the universal absolute unifies the non-personal unqualified with the personalizable deity absolute.
You've got to draw a line, though, between the conjoined actor and the universal absolute.
But consider the relationship of the conjoined actor to the spiritual domains of the eternal Son and to the physical domains of the Isle of Paradise. Here, on the level of actuality, we see a functional coordination which is analogous to this unification taking place on the level of potentiality. I see a greater kinship between the conjoined actor and the universal absolute than between any other two of the seven original realities.
But they are separate.
Of course they are entirely. I see a greater functional relationship between paradise and the unqualified absolute. If I want to get any feeling for the unqualified absolute, I'm going to study paradise. This is non-personal, extra-divine, and undeified in its actual, not just potential. And it's infinite in potential. No matter how much mass appears in space, paradise will generate enough gravity to hold it very effectively in leash. The gravity potential of paradise is unlimited. When I think of the deity absolute, I see, in some ways, a greater kinship with the eternal Son. The deity absolute is personalizable, deified, divine, and nothing but that. And that is true of the Son. You might say, why don't you compare it with the Father? Because the Father is all things which the Son are and everything which the Son is not. The Father is the source of paradise as well as Father of the eternal Son. So onward, the first source and center, I should say. That's even larger than the concept, the first person of deity. Now we're thinking of the deified aspect of the universal Father. He's also everything else. I think of these steps as representing the only steps which God could take at that time. As you start in the first frame, he's only got two choices, as I see it. To leave it alone or separate it. Or scramble it. In the second frame, he has only two choices. Go back where we came from or set up a tension resolver so that we stay where we are by adding a third thing. In the fourth frame, it would appear to me he has only one choice, or two. Leave it the way it is, in which event I now fill the total of deity and can do nothing except fill it. Or I will now step away from myself. I will now produce a power platform so that I can go into action. The fourth frame is God winding up in the bullpen, and in the fifth frame he pitches.
Bill, the last frame is a mathematical exhaustion of absolutes, really. I mean, you couldn't do any more than that, except function with it.
That's right. And you produce your first sub-absolutes.
Yeah.
In Havona, you set up in principle everything. Because as you take inventory of what is in Havona, and let me inventory it to refresh your memory. The creatures of the central universe are material, morontial, spiritual, absonite, ultimate, co-absolute, and absolute. When the eternal Son bestowed himself in Havona, I don't think the Havona natives knew anything about it. Neither did Grandfanda and his associates. This bestowal of the eternal Son was something on the absolute, co-absolute level. And that's why the firstborn Michael, bestowed himself in Havona, and his bestowal was an interpretation of the bestowal of the eternal Son for the edification of these material, morontial, spiritual, and maybe absonite beings in Havona. Did you ever stop and think that there's going to be a heck of a lot going on in Havona that will be just as invisible to us as seraphim are now? Havona represents the full expression of God's intent on all levels of the firehouse and in perfection. The finites in Havona are true finites, but not imperfect finites. They're primary finite maximums.
Finality?
No, Havona natives. In eternity, the Father portrayed the firehouse in utter perfection, all 3 floors. And then he commissioned his sons to go out here in time and space, and 10 million worlds is 1% of the size of Havona. Each creator son is taking on 1% of the load which the Trinity took on when they produced Havona. The tension presence of the universal absolute signifies the adjustment of differential between deity reality and undeified reality inherent in the separation of the dynamics of free will divinity from the statics of unqualified infinity. Frame 3. No, he isn't in 2. The tension's in 2, but it's resolved in 3. Always remember, potential infinity is absolute and inseparable from eternity. What do they mean by that? Well, at any moment in time, there is a future. And if there's a future, there's growth. And if there's growth, you can't express everything now. Actual infinity in time can never be anything partial. That's what we just said. And therefore, must be non-absolute. If there is a future, we can't have it finished. Neither can infinity of actual personality be absolute except in unqualified deity. And it is the differential of infinity potential in the unqualified absolute and the deity absolute that eternalizes the universal absolute. This is explaining the origin of the universal absolute. Both of these circles in the second frame are infinite, but they're infinite in different ways. One is infinite statics, and the other is infinite dynamics. One is infinite causation, the other is infinite response. It is this differential of infinity potential that eternalizes the universal absolute. And this makes it possible, cosmically possible, to have material universes in space, and spiritually possible to have finite personalities in time. The firehouse is not going to cave in. There is Lebensraum for imperfect beings. We are not going to be crushed by the higher specific gravity of perfection. We're sort of like, let's say...
We might be crushed by dumb pop, so...
Oh, yeah. The finite can coexist in the cosmos along with the infinite. Now we're talking about the construction, the steel lattice reinforcing construction of the lower floors of the firehouse, which keeps the uppermost floor from crushing the lower floors, and especially protects the lowest floor. The finite can coexist in the cosmos along with the infinite only because the associative presence of the universal absolute so perfectly equalizes the tensions equalizes a lot of tension. And then they take inventory. What are these tensions? Time versus eternity. Finity versus infinity. Reality, the potential of reality versus the actuality of reality. Paradise versus space. Man versus God. If you have a glass full of water and you pour from another beaker quicksilver into that glass of water, what will happen? The quicksilver will displace the water. In this sense, perfection has a much higher specific gravity than imperfection. And how are we going to keep enough emptiness around here for imperfection to grow with a lower specific gravity in the presence of things which have a higher specific gravity? It's the universal absolute that keeps the quicksilver out of the glass of water, thus keeping us from being displaced in reality. The function of the universal absolute is going to grow and grow and grow and grow because there's going to be more and more and more of us. It may be possible that the finaliters will partially attain the deity absolute, but even if they should, still, in the eternity of eternities, he's saying many, many now, the problem of the universal absolute will continue to intrigue, mystify, baffle, and challenge the ascending and progressing finaliters, for we perceive that the unfathomability of the cosmic relationships of the universal absolute will tend to grow in proportions as the material universes and their spiritual administration continue to expand. Doesn't that sentence now have a lot more meaning for you?
Much.
You see, what we're engaged in is Operation Bootstrap. We must take one part of the book to help us understand another part of the book. They don't write any section on the limitations of the Universal Father or the limitations of the Infinite Spirit, but they do write a section, the limitations of the Eternal Son. He has the most, therefore he is the most limited. He has the most perfect relationship with the three deities. He knows a Father. And he also knows an offspring who is equal. The Father knows the experience of both being a father and a grandfather, but he has no father. The Infinite Spirit has the unique experience of double deity ancestry, but he knows no offspring who is his equal. His offspring are multiple and are sub-absolute. They are the seven master spirits. Each deity has such a unique relationship. They're not just three carbon copies up there. There is no greater possible difference between three people than exists between the three persons of deity. They are utterly dissimilar and yet equally divine.
Perfectly unified.
And perfectly unified. Yes.
Is there more to the Eternal Son than personality and spirit?
No, that's it.
That is all.
That's it. He is unqualifiedly personal. He is unqualifiedly spiritual.
That's the limit.
The conjoined actor is the source of mind. We think of him as mind, but he's also spirit, like the sun. And it is this pre-mind spirit which he can fragment. He gives origin not only to the primary supernatum of paradise, but he gives origin to beings who in turn give origin to the physical control creatures. There's versatility. He can operate he can play on all the pianos there are. He can even draw checks against the Universal Father's bank account because he's got an attorney in fact from the Father. If you, in terms of being, nothing escapes relationship to the Universal Father. In terms of function, nothing escapes relationship to the third source and center. Now, this is not true of the Eternal Son. Material reality has no relationship to the Eternal Son as such. Spiritual reality has no relationship to paradise as the absolute machine. But both the first and third source and center cut right across the whole gamut of reality. Spiritual reality has no relationship to the unqualified absolute. And I don't think material reality has any relationship to the deity absolute. But all reality has relationship to the universal absolute. Let's look at the seventh triunity. We have been discussing the seventh triunity. This is the relationship between the universal Father, the conjoint actor, and the universal absolute. The three realities that cut across everything. The conjoint act, this is the unity of infinity, functionally manifest in time and eternity. This is the coordinate unification of actuals and potentials. This group consists of the Father, the conjoint actor, the universal absolute. The conjoint actor universally integrates the varying functional aspects of all actualized reality on all levels of manifestation, from finites through transcendentals and on to absolutes. He's dealing with actuals. He's not the source of all actuals, but he functionally integrates all actuality. The universal absolute perfectly compensates the differentials inherent in the varying aspects of all incomplete reality, potential reality, from the limitless potentials of active, volitional, and causative deity reality to the boundless possibilities of static, reactive, non-deity reality in the incomprehensible domains of the unqualified absolute. As they function in this triunity, the conjoint actor and the universal absolute are alike responsive to deity and to non-deity presences, as also is the first source and center, who, in this relationship, is to all intents and purposes conceptually indistinguishable from the I am.
You've got the whole universe.
This is the master linkage here of everything, functionally. There are four kinds of motion. Primary motion is the motion of space itself, space respiration. It's an absolute motion because it's motion in relation to something non-moving, paradise. Secondary motion is also absolute motion. It's the clockwise, counterclockwise precessional of the space levels. Tertiary motion is relative. It is all other motion other than the two that are inventoried, except for the fourth kind of motion, which is compensatory motion. Motion initiated by the universal absolute, designed to compensate the balance of the universe of universes. Associatively, now remember, every time you get something new, the universal absolute has got to take on more load. Are you with this? Do you see this now? This is Atlas, holding up the Earth. Associatively, the universal absolute constitutes the identification of the zone of progressing evolutional reality. And this reality exists on two levels of the firehouse, the time-space level and in the transcended time-space level, the second floor. And these two floors together are universes of sub-infinite deity manifestation. They're less than infinite. So here, you know, down in Washington, they've got a census meter, I'm told. I've never seen it. And you can see births and deaths clicking and the cumulative net total of the pluses and the minuses. And up on Paradise, we might paraphrase it. They've got a universal absolute meter. And you can see the load building up every time a new person's born, a new world comes into being. You see, as long as it's space potency, he doesn't have anything to compensate. Because that's secure in the grasp of his associate, the unqualified absolute. But the minute the force organizers start monkeying around with that, it becomes sub-absolute, and it clicks again. The load goes up. And this is why we're never going to catch him. He's growing in proportion to total cosmic growth. And we are growing only as one creature can grow, and we ourselves contribute to the addition to this load.
Is potentiality weightless?
To him, yes, if it's absolute potentiality. But sub-absolute potentiality would increase his load. And all potentiality, I don't think, is absolute. I think you have the potentials of the ultimate derived from up here. And I think you also have the potentialities of the supreme derived from up here, possibly through the ultimate. When a creative spirit produces seraphim, in the final analysis, I think she drafts on the deity absolute. But to all practical intents and purposes, I think the branch bank that cashes her check is the potentialities of the Supreme, which is the local finite branch of the bank of the deity absolute.
He gets the power bill.
Yeah.
Well,
She's drafting on finite potentials, not absolute potentials, because these seraphim are not absolute, they're finite. And I think the potentials of the Supreme add to the load of the universal absolute. I think the potentials of the ultimate add to the load of the universal absolute. I do not think potentials on the absolute level have anything to do with load.
But he's still...
But all sub-absolute potentials, all sub-absolute actuals add to this law. The universal absolute is the potential of the static dynamic deity, functionally realizable on time-eternity levels as finite absolute values and as possible of experiential existential approach. This incomprehensible aspect of deity may be static, potential, and associative, but is not experientially creative or evolutional as concerns the intelligent personalities now functioning in the master universe. Now, really, that isn't hard.
I just can't go that fast.
They're talking now about the universal absolute, not as an associative presence. But what is the universal absolute as such? Is this
Association.
The steel
apart from the association? They're now considering this absolute as an absolute, not as a steel structure, as a third absolute. We've been talking about the unqualified absolute. We've been talking about the deity absolute. Up until this time, we've been talking about the universal absolute pretty much as just an associative presence. But is there any meaning or value to the universal absolute apart from the fact of association? Yes, there is. This is an inventory of the universal absolute all alone, apart from the deity and unqualified absolutes. He is the potential, which means he is an emptiness in which action can take place. I quote again from Lao Tzu, "The virtue of an empty vessel is that it can be filled." The emptiness inherent in the universal absolute has the virtue of providing an arena in which action can take place and in which transactions can be consummated. The universal absolute is an emptiness. And what is this emptiness, this room for action? In this emptiness, static dynamic deity can do something. What in the dickens is static dynamic deity? It's the relationship between the deity absolute and the unqualified absolute. It can perform some functions. These functions are going to result in the realization of some things. And the things are going to take place, grow, evolve, be created, fragmentized, eventuated on time-eternity levels. This is a conjoining of time and eternity. Is such a thing comprehensible? Why, certainly. An adjuster is an eternity entity, and we're time creatures. This is taking place right in our own experience. These things are going to be realized as finite absolute values. Well, the adjuster is a qualified absolute, and if anything, as finite we are. If the Supreme Being can ever associate with God the Ultimate, this is the same type of association taking place on a deity level, isn't it? And in the Trinity of Trinities, it's projected that finites and absolutes will be associated on the second level of the Trinity of Trinities, which would be made up of God the Supreme, God the Ultimate, and God the Absolute. And these goals are goals which are possible to an experiential, existential approach. Experiential, existential deity would be God the Absolute, which would represent the experientialization of the existential deity absolute. Anytime you use the term God the Absolute, you are assuming that the deity absolute has become experientially personified. The deity absolute is a pre-personal deity, not yet a person. Says, again, my old pal, the grizzled censor, I always think of him as growling, says this universal censor, we know the universal Father, the eternal Son, and the infinite Spirit as persons, but I do not personally know the deity absolute. I love and worship God the Father. I respect and honor the deity absolute. Those words give me a feeling for his feeling. Yes,
The
Helene.
deity absolute isn't personalized when he says he is
No.
perfected.
No, the deity absolute is a pre-personal deity. God the Absolute is our conception of the personalization of that deity. The pre-personal deity absolute is an existential reality. The personalization of this deity absolute would be by experiential techniques. So, they're talking about the union of the existential and the experiential. If our conjecture about thought adjusters is correct, did they have an origin in time? I don't think so. Even if the Father should fragment an adjuster now, I think that transaction would take place above the stream of time. A thought adjuster is something like an existential reality, certainly an eternal reality. We are experiential realities. Here is another type of union taking place. You see, they're talking about us in here as well as deity. So, the universal absolute marks out a zone in which statics and dynamics can be associated. They can be associated on time-eternity levels. They can be associated as finite absolute values, and they can be approached by experiential existential techniques. This incomprehensible aspect of deity may be static, potential, and associative. Those are the first three levels of the function of total deity, but is not experientially creative, fourth level, or evolutional, fifth level, as concerns the intelligent personalities now functioning in the master universe. This is deity. This is not non-deity. But it's limited as to function. Whereas the Father is unlimited.